Hello and welcome to this training on records management. My name is John Nacero. I'm the administrator of the Governance, Risk Management, and Compliance Office here at BNI.
And I'm Jennifer Kennedy, the Manager of Corporate Compliance.
Jim, when we talk about records, there's a variety. There's print records, there's electronic records, but is there an overarching framework that we can focus on when it talks about records management? I think there is, and I think that's kind of where we're going to focus today.
Yeah, I think that regardless of paper or electronic records, we do have management processes in place. We're going to look at that as well as the elements for record keeping standards and progress and service note requirements.
And I think the last one is key because you always want to reinforce in the progress note what actually happened, because that's tied into the financial process, which a lot of people don't necessarily know about. So I think it's important to get into that. I think it's also important to know who this really impacts, because every employee that provides direct care or even employees are responsible for support services. That includes human resources, the IT department, and finance are responsible for regular records management.
Right. I think also, what we're talking about really are original hard copy or electronic documents. These are treatment and service plans, ISPs, daily or monthly notes, quarterly notes, letters, payroll records, employee schedules, all fall under the category of records management.
And I think it's important that we do this because it not only demonstrates compliance with regulatory or contractual obligations as a best practice, but there's a number of different purposes of records that we're required to comply with. Just regular documentation and continuity of care documentation is required by licensing authorities. So it's important that we do that. I know during your audits, that's one area that you focus on. You and your team is looking at what is actually contained in the record, because it's really the solid foundation of how the patient or the client's healthcare is captured.
Right, their healthcare as well as how we capture their outcome and goal data so that we can look at progress being made or a lack of progress. Also, these records are a legal document, whether they are hard copy or electronic. It does serve as a legal document. And we also want to use our records for data, for analysis, for education, and possibly research.
And I think that's the way that we get better in serving our clients, is going back and looking at what was done to see what can be improved in the future. When you're looking at progress notes, is there a minimum standard that you look at when it comes to requirements?
Right. When we look at notes, we always have to demonstrate the necessity for services. Our progress notes always have to tie back into treatment plan goals and objectives or ISP outcomes and goals. If we're not doing that, we're not fulfilling that first level of what the note is supposed to do. We also want to make sure that the documentation is prompt. We want to write those notes as soon as possible after a session or a visit has occurred. We want to be able to support billing, and we know that the longer we wait, the more we're going to miss when we write that note out.
Sure.
We also have to make sure that we're always indicating either progress towards the goal or a lack of progress. And if we have a lack of progress, we also need to document how we're addressing that.
Absolutely. And when you look at the different components in a record, there's a number of areas that's required to be there. And I think it's important to note that there is no real cookie cutter approach when it comes to record components, because each record is unique and it's important to maintain separate records for each consumer. But there is a number of things that you look for when it comes to what is contained in a record, being personal or demographic information, making sure the photograph is current and up to date, making sure all incident reports are filed, all assessments are done, looking at a current individual support plan, as well as invitations, signature sheets, and progress notes.
Right. Our regulations for our licensed programs, as well as some regulations that apply to our unlicensed programs, lay out exactly what has to be in that consumer's record, and we are held to those standards.
Absolutely. And when you look into progress notes, you must include the full name of the consumer, make sure there's no nicknames and the name is spelled correctly, because of course, if it isn't, it gives the implication that it's not the correct consumer. It's making sure that the record is legible and reproducible. We'll get to that in a moment. Having the service provider, the date of service. And it's also important to note start and end times of services, isn't it?
Right. We need the start and end times. We also need the indicator of the AM, PM. We want to have a second identifier on that page. We also need the name, title, and signature and date of the person who completed the note. We need to know the location of the treatment. We need to know the amount, frequency, and duration. And that's important because, again, that ties back to their individual support plan. Did we meet that is one of the indicators that the department is looking for.
When we look at best practices in terms of what should be in a medical record, I always go back to the 5 C's. I always want to make sure that the record is concise, so you don't say anything more than what you said, but you make sure that after someone reads the record, they have a clear idea of what was done. I think it also makes sure to have it complete, so all the information is there, and it's written in an objective manner, doesn't include any inappropriate statements or personal opinion. I also think that with the advent of electronic records, being clear and legibly written has kind of taken a back seat because people can type. But even with hard copy records here, make sure that people can understand what specifically is captured there. So it's important to note that it's legible. It's also important to make sure everything in there is correct and in chronological order. So you don't have to search for anything. That's difficult, to not put that continuity of care in place.
Correct.
I always, too, go back with the documentation to the acronym I learned from the FDA when it comes to medical records, and that is ALCOA, and that's making sure that everything's attributable, legible, contemporaneous, organized, and accurate. And it's a lot of the points we touched on before. It's making sure that you know who completed the note,
right?
Someone understands what was done, so it can be read. Contemporaneous is a fancy word, but it means real time, so just making sure everything is done within real time. I think your recommendation is generally 24 hours to 48 hours after the visit is done to make sure that people remember what it is that they were doing, correct? Yep. Make sure it's organized and also make sure it's accurate. Is there any other best practices that we can get into and help people?
You know, a best practice is to avoid technical language. We don't want to make it so complicated that people can't understand what the note says. We want to make sure that what's contained in the file justifies services that are billed. And that goes back to having notes that really reflect the time spent with that individual.
Sure.
We want to make sure that we're documenting the discrete service that was billed for. And really what people need to understand is that the standard is that if you don't document it, it didn't happen.
Absolutely. When we look at record storage, there's a number of different ways people store records here. Is there any tips and tricks we can recommend for them to make sure that they store their records appropriately?
Right. You know, we prefer electronic records. We know that a lot of our programs are still in the paper record process. You know, we want to make sure that we secure those records.
Sure. That
we're not leaving them out. If those records have to be transported, that we keep track of them at all time. We don't want to leave them in vehicles if we don't have to. You know, and we want to make sure that we're keeping track and keeping everything as secure as we possibly can.
Absolutely. And I think the key takeaway for this is what everyone should always remember is that we don't throw around the word noncompliance regularly, but poor documentation leads to noncompliance. And if it's not specific noncompliance, it's the perception that noncompliance occurred. And anytime there's issues of noncompliance, it also could potentially mean lost money, lost revenue that we have to send back. So I think it's important to always note the clear-cut importance of what the documentation is, why it's being done, and best practices that you can use to make sure that your documentation meets the standards that we have here at VNI.
Right, and I think it's worth noting as we move forward that the state and counties, as well as our payers, are getting tougher on this, and they're looking at the documentation, and if it does not rise to their standards, they will demand that monies are returned.
Thank you very much for joining us for today on this training on records management and documentation. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to contact Jen or myself or contact the GRC office. We'll make sure we can answer your question and get you the information that you're looking for. Again, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.